The quiet worker of the morning light came through the tall windows of the mansion, touching the polished floors with a soft, golden glow. In the kitchen, the sound of gentle footsteps moved quietly from one counter to another. The maid had already been awake for hours, her hands busy, her mind calm. She never spoke much, not because she had nothing to say, but because life had taught her that silence was safer. She moved with a kind of quiet rhythm, like someone who knew exactly what needed to be done before anyone asked. Every day was almost the same. She would sweep the wide hallways, dust the heavy shelves, and carry trays to the dining room without a sound. The family she worked for barely noticed her presence, and that was fine with her. She liked blending into the background, letting her work speak for her. But there was something no one in that house knew, a part of her life she kept hidden away. The mansion was full of rooms that most people never entered. One of them was the sitting room. With its tall curtains and shelves of old books, in the far corner stood a grand piano. Covered with a thin layer of dust, it had not been played in years. And most days, it sat like a forgotten piece of the past. But every time she passed that room, her eyes would drift toward it. She would dust the keys gently, just enough to keep them clean, never pressing one. Her fingers always itched to touch them, but she never dared. After all, she was just the maid, and maids didn't sit at pianos in the mornings. While the family was still asleep, she worked quickly and quietly. The sound of her broom brushing against the floor was the only thing breaking the silence. Sometimes she would hum very softly, just enough for herself to hear. It was a habit from long ago, when music had been a part of her days, but in this house, she kept it locked away. Just like her words, her life outside of work was simple. She rented a small room in a quiet neighborhood, cooked her own meals, and spent her evenings reading or walking alone. There were no grand parties, no large circle of friends, just the steady routine of work and rest. She had learned to be content with little, finding comfort in small moments. The smell of fresh bread in the morning, the cool air after a summer rain, the quiet before dawn, these were the things she held on to. Still, there was a loneliness in her life. It wasn't the kind of loneliness that made her cry, but the kind that sat quietly beside her. Always there, she had dreams once, big ones, but they had faded over time now. The piano in the sitting room was the only reminder of those dreams. Whenever she dusted it, she felt a small spark inside, but she always turned away before it could grow. The family she worked for never asked much about her. They knew she did her job well, and that was all that mattered to them. They didn't know her past, her skills, or her talents. To them, she was the quiet worker who kept the house running smoothly, and in truth, she didn't mind that they didn't ask. It meant she could keep her secrets, but sometimes, when she was alone in the kitchen, her hands would move across the counter as if they were dancing over piano keys. Her body remembered the feeling, even if her mind told her to forget. She could still hear the sound of music in her head, like a soft memory she could never fully let go of. It had been years since she had touched a piano, years since she had felt the smooth keys under her fingertips. And yet, the memory was as sharp as ever. One afternoon, she carried fresh linens up the grand staircase. She heard a faint creak from the sitting room door. It was open just a little, sunlight spilling across the floor and catching the edge of the piano. For a moment she paused, her breath held without meaning to. The house was quiet, completely still. Her heart beat a little faster, but she turned and walked on. Not today, she told herself. Not yet. She finished her work that day as she always did, quietly, efficiently, without drawing attention, but something inside her felt unsettled. She could not stop thinking about the way the sunlight had touched the piano keys. It was as if the room itself had been calling to her. She tried to push the thought away, focusing on folding the last set of towels, but even as the sun began to set and the house grew still again, the image stayed with her. The quiet worker had a secret, and she didn't yet know that soon the entire house would hear it. The forgotten piano the next morning began like any other. The maid woke before the first light touched the horizon, the quiet street still empty outside her window. She dressed in her simple uniform, tied her hair back, and made her way to the mansion. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth from the night's light rain. She liked this time of day, the world still asleep, no noise, no rush, only the sound of her own footsteps inside the mansion. The air was cool and still. She unlocked the back door and stepped in. Placing her bag on the small wooden stool in the kitchen, she moved with practiced care, lighting the stove, boiling water for tea, laying out the family's breakfast. Her hands worked automatically, her mind quiet by the time the first hints of sunlight poured through the tall windows. She was already dusting the hallways. It was while carrying her cleaning supplies past the sitting room that she noticed it again. The door stood slightly open, a thin line of light cutting across the floor inside. The piano was there, just as it had always been. But something felt different today. Perhaps it was the way the light from the tall window fell directly on the keys, making them gleam despite the dust. She stopped without meaning to. Staring for a few seconds longer than she should have, her fingers twitched slightly, as if they remembered a language her mouth no longer spoke.
Ow.
She glanced down the hallway, listening. The house was silent, the family still sleeping upstairs. She stepped inside the room, slow and careful, her shoes barely making a sound on the thick carpet. The air smelled faintly of old paper and wood polish, the kind of scent that carried memories. She walked around the piano, her hand brushing over its smooth wooden edge. The dust on top felt soft under her fingers, and she wiped it away in a slow line, revealing the rich dark wood beneath. Her eyes drifted to the keys. She remembered the first time she had touched a piano, long ago in a small school hall. Back then, her teacher had told her she had a gift, a way of making the notes feel alive. It had been years since she had felt that same spark. She lowered herself onto the bench, her heart beating faster. Her hands hovered above the keys. But she didn't press down yet. It felt almost like standing on the edge of something unknown. Her breath caught, and she pulled her hands back. She stood quickly, dusting the top instead, telling herself it was better not to start something she couldn't finish. But as she moved away, her eyes kept pulling back to it. It was strange how a silent object could speak so loudly to her. Even as she worked in other rooms, the image of the piano stayed in her mind. She found herself cleaning faster, almost without realizing it. By the time she returned to the sitting room in the afternoon, the sun had shifted, casting long golden beams across the floor. This time she didn't stand in the doorway. She went straight to the bench and sat down. Her palms rested on her lap for a moment, the stillness almost too heavy. Finally, she placed her fingers on the keys and pressed one. The sound was soft, warm, and a little uneven from disuse. She pressed another and another, letting the simple tones drift into the air. The sound seemed to wrap around her, filling the quiet space like a voice long forgotten. Her hands began to move without her thinking. A melody she thought she had forgotten came back to her as if it had been waiting all these years. The notes were gentle but full, the kind of sound that made the air feel different. Her eyes closed as her fingers found their way, moving with a smoothness that surprised her for a moment. She was not the maid in a mansion. She was the girl who once believed in music. She played for herself, not for an audience, not for applause. And in that empty room, it felt like the music understood her in a way words never had. She lost track of time. When she finally stopped, the sound faded slowly, leaving the air heavy with silence. Her heartbeat slowed, and she sat still for a moment. It had been so long since she had felt that kind of release. She stood and smoothed her skirt, a small smile forming before she caught herself. This was her secret, and it would stay that way. She returned to her chores. But something had shifted inside her. The house no longer felt as cold as before. The piano was no longer just furniture. It was a part of her. And now that she had touched it, she knew she would come back again. She didn't know it yet. But the quiet moments she stole with that instrument would soon change the way everyone in the mansion saw her. An empty afternoon, the week passed quietly every day. The maid kept to her routine, finishing her tasks before the family woke, moving through the grand rooms like a shadow. But now there was a new rhythm to her day. Whenever the house grew still, and no one was near, her steps slowed outside the sitting room, her eyes drawn to the door. The piano was no longer just an object in the corner. It had become a quiet promise to herself. She never played for long, only a few minutes here, and there it was enough to feel the smooth keys under her fingers, to hear the soft sound filling the room. Each time, she would leave quickly, making sure no one saw. The secret made her feel lighter somehow, even as she kept her face calm when working. One Saturday afternoon, the mansion felt even more silent than usual. The family had left early for a social gathering in the city, planning to stay overnight. The echo of their voices and footsteps faded, replaced by the sound of rain starting to fall outside, the windows blurred with drops, the sky turning a soft gray. The maid moved through the kitchen, finishing the last of the dishes. But her mind wasn't on the plates in her hands. She knew the house was hers until morning. That thought alone made her heart beat faster. She dried her hands and walked toward the sitting room. Her steps were slow, almost careful. As though the air itself might stop her, the door was open, the light dim but warm from the tall windows. The piano waited in the corner. The dust on its surface now thinner from her frequent visits, she crossed the room and sat on the bench, the seat creaking softly beneath her for a moment. She just listened to the rain against the glass, the sound steady and calming. Her fingers touched the keys and a soft chord filled the space. It blended with the rain, the two sounds weaving together until it felt like they belonged to the same song. She began to play, her hands moving with more confidence than before. The melody was gentle but carried something deeper, a feeling she couldn't name. It wasn't just music, it was a piece of herself she had hidden away for too long. She let the notes stretch, filling the empty mansion with warmth for the first time. She played without looking over her shoulder. She wasn't thinking about being caught or about whether she belonged here. She simply played because she needed to. The piano seemed to respond to her touch. The sound rich and alive despite its years of silence. Her eyes closed and she breathed with the rhythm. Outside, the rain grew heavier, the drops hitting the glass in time with the music. She didn't know how long she'd been there when she heard a faint creak from somewhere down the hall. Her fingers froze on the keys. The sound came again, like the slow opening of a door. Her heart skipped, a rush of panic climbing up her chest. She stood quickly, the bench scraping lightly against the floor. She told herself it was just the wind, maybe the rain against the shutters. Still, she moved to the door and peered out into the hallway. It was empty. No voices, no footsteps, only the steady patter of rain. She let out a breath she didn't know she was holding and stepped back inside. Her hands hovered over the keys again. But something inside her hesitated. The spell had been broken. She closed the piano softly and returned to her chores. Even as she folded laundry and wiped the counters, the echo of that sound stayed with her. Had someone been there, listening? That night, after she finished her work, she sat by the kitchen window with a cup of tea. The rain had stopped, the streets outside glistening in the lamplight. She thought about the music she had played earlier. It was strange, but she realized she wanted someone to hear it just once, not for applause, but because it was the truest part of herself. Still, the fear of being seen kept her silent. As she washed her cup and prepared to leave, she passed the sitting room one last time. The moonlight touched the piano now, silver and soft. She almost went inside again, almost let herself play one more song before bed. But she stopped at the doorway. Something told her the time would come soon when she would no longer be able to keep this secret. And when that day arrived, her life in the mansion would never be the same again. Fingers on the keys, the morning air inside the mansion was cool and quiet. The family had left early for errands in town, their voices fading into the distance before. The front door closed. The maid stood in the kitchen, rinsing the last of the breakfast dishes, her mind far from the sink in front of her. She could hear the silence in the house, the kind that felt deep and safe. It was the kind of quiet that made the piano seem to call her name. Even though she had never spoken it aloud, she dried her hands on her apron and walked slowly toward the sitting room. Her shoes made almost no sound on the polished floor. When she stepped inside, the light from the tall windows fell across the piano like a spotlight. Dust no longer clung to the top. She had made sure of that in her daily cleaning. The keys looked clean too, a soft ivory glow waiting beneath her fingertips. She sat down on the bench, her fingers resting lightly on her lap. For a moment, she listened to the ticking of the clock in the corner. Then, with a slow breath, she placed her hands on the keys. The first note rang out soft and warm, filling the still air. It was like breathing after holding her breath too long. She played another note, then another, letting them form a melody. The song was one she remembered from years ago. It had no words, but each note carried a story of mornings in her childhood home, sunlight through lace curtains, of moments that had felt safe. Her fingers moved faster, flowing from memory. Each chord deeper and richer than the last, the sound filled the room. Reached the hallway, maybe even the stairs, but she didn't think about that. Her eyes closed, her head tilted slightly, as if the music itself was guiding her hands. Outside, the sky was bright, the air clear after the rain the day before. Inside, the notes rose and fell, soft at first, then stronger. She forgot the mansion, forgot her job, forgot the fear of being caught for these few minutes. There was only the piano and the way it seemed to answer her heart. She leaned into the melody, letting it swell and soften, each phrase a secret. She had never told. She didn't hear the front door open. She didn't hear the sound of footsteps crossing the hall. Someone had returned earlier than planned, moving quietly. Drawn by a sound they had never heard in the house before, the music led them to the sitting room door, which stood open. And there she was, her eyes closed, her fingers gliding across the keys as if she had been born to play them, the figure. At the door didn't speak, they just stood there watching, unsure whether to interrupt or let the moment unfold. The maid's posture was different now, her back straight. Her face softened, her whole body alive in a way it never seemed during the day's chores. It was as if this quiet worker had transformed into someone else entirely. The final notes of the song lingered in the air, fading slowly until only the ticking clock remained. When she opened her eyes and saw the person standing in the doorway, her heart jumped. She froze, her hands hovering above the keys before pulling them back quickly. "I'm sorry," she said softly, her voice almost a whisper. She stood, smoothing her apron, as if to erase the moment. "I was just dusting," she added, even though they had both heard the music. There was a pause, the kind that stretched long enough to make her stomach twist. But instead of scolding her, the person at the door stepped closer. "That was beautiful," they said quietly. She lowered her gaze, unsure how to respond. She wasn't used to her work being noticed, let alone her music. Her hands trembled slightly, and she clasped them together to hide it. "You play like you've done this all your life," they continued. She gave a small nod but didn't answer. The silence between them was not heavy, but it was full. It was the kind of silence that comes when someone sees a part of you you've kept hidden. After a moment, they simply smiled and said, "Please, keep playing." Before leaving the room, she sat there for a long while after they left, her hands resting on the keys, her mind spinning. The fear of being caught had always kept her from playing too long, but now someone had heard her, and instead of anger, they had shown kindness. She didn't know what it meant yet, but something in her heart felt lighter. The music had reached someone, even if it was just one person. She pressed the keys again, this time with a small smile. The notes rose softly into the afternoon air. And for the first time, she felt that maybe her music didn't need to stay a secret forever. The invitation, the days after that quiet conversation, felt different. The maid went about her chores as usual, sweeping the hallways, dusting the shelves, arranging flowers, but there was a faint, unspoken tension in the air. It wasn't a bad tension, more like the moment before a storm, when the wind changes and you know something is coming. She caught herself thinking about the words she had heard in the sitting room. "I'd like you to play for the family sometime." They played over. In her mind, soft but insistent, she didn't know whether she wanted that or feared it. Playing alone was one thing, just her, the piano, and the empty room. But playing in front of people, in front of the ones she served every day, that was something else entirely. Her hands trembled at the thought, not because she doubted the music, but because it meant letting them see a part of herself she had hidden for so long. A week passed before it happened. It was a cool evening, the sun low, sky streaked with gold and pale blue. The family had gathered in the sitting room before dinner, a rare moment when everyone was in one place. The maid was clearing away teacups when the head of the household looked up and spoke. "Why don't you play something for us?" The words landed like a stone in her chest. For a moment, she froze, her hands tightening around the tray. She began, her voice quiet. "I'm not sure if you can," they interrupted gently, their tone calm but certain. A few others looked up curious. "You play?" someone asked, their voice carrying real surprise. "She does," came the answer. "And it's worth hearing." The room seemed to grow warmer, the air thicker. She set the tray down carefully on a side table, her movements slow. The piano was only a few steps away, but in that moment, it felt like miles. Her eyes lingered on it, the black and white keys catching the light from the tall windows. It had always been her escape, her private place. Now it felt like a stage. She walked toward it slowly, aware of every pair of eyes on her. Her heartbeat was loud in her ears, her hands slightly damp. She sat on the bench, smoothing her apron. To steady herself, the room had gone completely quiet. She took a slow breath, her fingers hovering above the keys. The first note was soft, almost hesitant, then another, and another. The melody forming like a familiar path under her hands. The music began to fill the room, weaving through the air. At first, she played cautiously, each note carefully measured, but as the song unfolded, she began to forget the audience. Her body leaned into the music, her touch on the keys growing lighter. Freer, the sound warmed the air, touched the walls, softened the edges of the silence. She played a piece she had carried in her heart for years. It wasn't grand or flashy. It was honest, full of small rises and gentle falls. The kind of song that carried pieces of a person's life inside it. As she played, her eyes closed and her breathing steadied. The nervousness melted away, replaced by the quiet certainty that this was where she belonged. When the last note faded, there was a moment where no one moved. It was the kind of pause that came when people were still caught inside what they had just heard. Then, softly, someone clapped. The sound grew, filling the room. It wasn't loud or demanding. It was warm, genuine, the kind of applause that reached straight into the heart. She looked down quickly, feeling her face grow warm. She wasn't used to being the center of anything. The head of the household smiled at her from across the room. That, they said simply, is a gift. She didn't know what to reply, so she just nodded, her hands resting gently in her lap as she stood. A few others asked if she could play again sometime. Her first instinct was to retreat, to say no. But then she thought of how the room had felt while she was playing, how even the air seemed to listen. "Maybe," she said quietly, and the answer brought small smiles to more than one face. That night, as she prepared the house for the evening, her mind kept returning to the moment she had started the song. The fear had been there, yes, but so had something else, something stronger. She realized now that sharing her music had not taken anything away from her. Instead, it had given her something new, and deep down, she knew she wanted to feel that again. A new beginning. The days after her first performance in the sitting room felt lighter. Something had changed, not just in how the family looked at her, but in how she moved through the mansion. She was still the maid, still carrying out her duties quietly and without complaint. But now there was a new kind of respect in the way people spoke to her. It was subtle, but she noticed it. They looked her in the eye more often, said thank you more sincerely, smiled when she passed, and every few days, someone would ask, "Will you play tonight?" Sometimes it was a request from the head of the household, other times a shy question from the younger ones. At first, she said yes only now and then, but slowly. It became a part of the rhythm of the house. After the day's work was done, she would sit at the piano and the family would gather quietly. No one demanded it. No one treated it like a performance. They simply listened. The music changed the evenings. It filled the grand rooms with warmth, breaking up the silence that used to settle like dust after dinner. Some nights she played soft, slow melodies that made the air feel gentle and calm. Other nights she let her fingers move faster, bringing brightness and energy into the room. It wasn't about showing skill, it was about sharing something real, something alive. One evening the rain returned, tapping against the windows in steady rhythm. The family gathered in the sitting room without even asking if she would play. It had become a quiet tradition. She sat down at the bench, her hands resting for a moment before touching the keys. She began with a melody that rose and fell like the rain outside. It felt natural, unforced, as though the piano and the weather were speaking to each other. She didn't think about who she was in the house anymore. She didn't think about her place or her title in those moments. She was simply someone who could give something beautiful, and that was enough. She saw it in the way they listened, not as a maid playing for her employers, but as a person sharing something that belonged to her alone. Sometimes after she finished playing, they would tell her how the music reminded them of something, a place they once visited, a person they once knew. She listened quietly, smiling, knowing that each person heard something different. That was the magic of it her notes carried. Stories she hadn't lived, feelings she hadn't named, but they reached people all the same. As the weeks passed, she noticed something else. The piano itself seemed different now. When she first found it, it had been silent, a little stiff, its notes uneven from years of neglect. Now, it was alive again, its sound fuller, its touch warmer. It was as if it, too, had been waiting for someone to bring it back to life. One afternoon, while dusting the room, she paused beside the piano and let her hand rest on it. She realized it had given her more than just a place to play. It had given her a voice she hadn't known she could still use, and it had changed the way she saw herself. She was still quiet, still not one to speak much, but she no longer felt invisible. The moment that made this clear came one evening when a guest visited the mansion. They were an old friend of the family, a well-dressed man with kind eyes. After dinner, the head of the household asked her to play. She hesitated for a moment, but then sat at the piano. The music flowed easily, the sound warm and full in the high-ceilinged room. When she finished, the guest leaned forward and said, "That was the best part of the evening." It was such a simple thing to say, but it stayed with her, because it wasn't about skill or perfection. It was about how her music made people feel. She realized then that even though she had kept this gift hidden for so long, it had always been a part of her, and now, instead of keeping it locked away, she could let it out whenever she wanted. On her way home that night, she walked a little slower. The streets were quiet, the air cool, the lamps casting pools of warm light on the wet pavement. She thought about the journey from that first hesitant note to now. It had all started with a single moment of courage. One quiet afternoon, when she sat down at a piano she wasn't supposed to touch, and now it had become a part of her life. The maid was still the same person she had always been, quiet, steady, gentle. But now, the people around her saw more. They saw the music, the depth, the quiet fire she carried. She didn't need to speak much. Her music said it all. And in the stillness of the mansion, with the piano waiting in the corner, she knew that as long as she had her music, she would never be truly silent again. The unseen audience. The next few days passed quietly. The maid continued her work as she always did, sweeping the halls, polishing the floors, dusting the shelves, yet something felt different inside her. Ever since that moment in the sitting room, she had carried the memory of being heard. It was a strange mix of fear and warmth, the fear that her secret might spread, and the warmth of knowing someone had appreciated it. She had not spoken about it, and no one else mentioned it either. But sometimes she thought she saw a knowing look in the eyes of the person who had caught her playing, as if they were carrying her secret too. The piano now pulled at her more than ever. Whenever the house was quiet, she would find herself drifting toward the sitting room. She still kept her visits short, but the music was growing bolder. Her hands moved with more confidence, her melodies stretching longer, richer. It was as if the keys had been waiting for her all along, and now they refused to let her go. One late afternoon, the sky outside was glowing gold. The family had gone out for a walk in the gardens, and the maid believed herself alone in the house. She entered the sitting room without hesitation, sitting at the piano and letting her fingers fall into a soft, flowing tune. This time she played something bright, something full of light. The notes danced in the air, filling the corners of the room, bouncing gently off the walls. Her eyes were closed, her body leaning with the rhythm, completely unaware that she was not alone at the far end of the hallway. Two of the younger members of the household had stopped. They had been on their way upstairs when they heard the sound. They exchanged glances. Neither of them had ever heard the piano in this house. Quietly, they crept closer, staying just beyond the doorway. From where they stood, they could see her back, the slight sway of her shoulders as she played. They didn't speak, afraid that even a whisper might break the spell. The maid played on. The melody shifted, growing softer, then stronger again, like a conversation between joy and longing. Her touch on the keys was gentle but sure, each note falling exactly where it needed to be. She didn't know that her music had gathered its own audience, silent and still. In that moment, the world was only the sound she was making when the song ended. She let the last note linger in the air before lifting her hands. She exhaled slowly, her heart steady now. She stood, smoothing her apron, and turned toward the door, only to freeze. The two young listeners were there, their eyes wide, caught between surprise and admiration. "Oh," she began, her voice breaking slightly. She hadn't expected anyone, not this time. They smiled, almost shyly, that was. "Amazing," one of them said softly. The other nodded. "I didn't know you could play like that." She lowered her gaze, unsure of what to say. Her instinct was to apologize, to explain that she had only been passing time, but the way they were looking at her like she had done something good made her stop. "Should play more," one of them said, their voice quiet but sincere. She shook her head quickly. "No. It's just something I used to do," but inside her heart warmed. She could feel the truth pressing at the edges of her silence. She wanted to play more. Not just for herself, but because someone had listened and understood without her having to say a single word. The two slipped away after a moment, their footsteps fading up the stairs. She stood alone in the doorway of the sitting room, her hands resting against the frame. She thought about how, in just a few short days, 3 people in this house had now heard her play. It was still a small secret, but it no longer felt entirely her own. She wondered how long it would be before the rest of the household learned about it. That evening, as the family gathered for dinner, she served the table in her usual quiet way. No one mentioned the piano, but she caught the 2 young listeners glancing at her, smiling in a way that seemed to carry a hidden meaning. It made her almost laugh inside, not out of amusement, but out of a strange growing hope, the kind of hope that felt fragile, like it might break if she moved too quickly. Later, when the house was dark and silent, she passed the sitting room one last time. She didn't go in, didn't touch the keys, but she stood there for a moment. The moonlight spilling over the piano, she knew she would return, and the next time, she might not be playing for an empty room at all. Silence and shock. It was late afternoon, when the rain began again. Steady tapping against the tall windows filled the mansion with a soft, steady sound. The family had returned from their trip into town and were upstairs in their rooms, preparing for the evening. The maid had finished arranging fresh flowers in the dining room and was on her way to return the vase to the kitchen. As she passed the sitting room, the open door caught her eye. The piano sat there, waiting in the dim golden light, the air around it warm and inviting. She hesitated, glancing toward the stairs. No voices, no footsteps, just the rain and the faint creak of the old house settling before she could think too much about it. She stepped inside, setting the vase gently on a side table. Her fingers brushed over the piano's smooth edge as she passed. She sat down on the bench, feeling the familiar comfort of its worn cushion. She placed her hands on the keys, letting a soft chord drift into the air. The sound seemed to blend with the rain outside, as if the weather itself had been waiting for her to play. This time, she chose a song she hadn't touched in years. It was slower, deeper, the kind of melody that carried both sorrow and hope in the same breath. Her eyes closed as she leaned into the music, each note shaping itself from memory. She forgot the house, forgot her place in it, forgot the risk. The music filled the sitting room, slid down the hallway, and up the grand staircase. Upstairs, someone paused, listening. One of the family members stepped out of their room, Drawn by the sound, they walked slowly toward the stairs, each step matching the rise and fall of the melody. By the time they reached the bottom, the music had grown richer. They followed it until they reached the doorway of the sitting room. There they stood, just beyond her view, watching from where they were. They could see her face relaxed, live, her hands moving with purpose and grace. This was not the quiet. A worker who passed silently through the halls. This was someone else entirely. Someone who carried a hidden light. They had never seen her like this. It was like catching a glimpse of a secret world. One that had been here all along, but unseen. The maid, lost in the music, had no idea she was being watched. Her mind was far away. In a place made of sound and memory, she played the last few lines of the song slowly, letting each note fade before moving to the next. When the final chord came, she held it, feeling it vibrate beneath her fingers, before letting it go. The silence that followed was deep, and then a voice, gentle but close. That was incredible. She spun slightly on the bench, her heart leaping into her throat. Standing in the doorway was one of the heads of the household. They were not smiling widely, but their eyes were full of something she didn't often say, genuine surprise. She began, standing quickly. I'm sorry. I shouldn't. Don't, they interrupted softly, stepping into the room. Don't apologize for something so beautiful. Her hands twisted together in front of her. Unsure where to place her gaze, her mind rushed with thoughts. Would this cost her the job, or had she crossed some unspoken line? They walked closer, stopping just beside the piano. How long have you been able to play like this? They asked. Her voice was quiet. Since I was young. Before I came here. They looked at the keys, then back at her. And you never told anyone? She shook her head. It wasn't important. There was a pause. You're wrong, they said finally. It is important. They rested a hand lightly on the edge of the piano, their eyes still on her. This house has been too quiet. For too long. Maybe it needed you to bring music back into it. Her breath caught. She didn't know what to say, the words sitting in her chest but refusing to come out. It was one thing to be caught by accident, by someone passing in the hall, but to be heard like this, and told her music mattered, was almost too much to take in. They stepped back, glancing at the door. I'd like you to play for the family sometime, they said. It wasn't a question, but it wasn't an order either. It was an invitation. She froze, unsure whether to nod or shake her head. I don't know if I can, she admitted. You already have, they replied simply, before turning and leaving the room. The maid stood by the piano for a long moment after they were gone. Her heart was still racing, but it was no longer from fear. Something had shifted. Quietly but permanently, she touched the keys one more time, letting a single note ring out. Before she closed the lid, the rain outside kept falling, soft and steady, and for the first time she wondered if maybe her music wasn't just for herself anymore.